There is no perfect Friday the 13th timeline. Since the movies are inconsistent with each other, and occasionally even themselves, I've seen well thought out timelines placing the original movie in April, June, or July of 1979, June of 1980, and even one impressively detailed timeline that placed it in 1975. I did my best to base the illustrations on, behind the scene shots and some pretty extensive Googling. I know these aren't perfect, and oftentimes each film contradicts itself, like part three, when two different actors appeared as Jason based on three different molds by multiple artists. This is purely my headcanon, so if you disagree with me, I totally get it, and you might even be right, and I could be wrong, but won't it be fun to dive in together? While specific dates seem to shift around, this is my take on the history of Jason Voorhees and the curse of Crystal Lake. In 1930, the future Mrs. Voorhees is born. 1935, the Christie family establishes Camp Crystal Lake in Crystal Lake, New Jersey. June 13th, 1946, Elias Voorhees and his 16-year-old wife, Pamela, give birth to Jason Voorhees. Jason is born with hydrocephalus, which is a condition that causes excess fluid in the brain. This causes cranial deformities and stunts his mental growth. At some point, Elias and Pamela divorce, and Elias starts a new family. He has one child, Diana. In the summer of 1957, Pamela Voorhees works as the Camp Crystal Lake cook. 11-year-old Jason attends the camp. He is bullied by the other kids and ignored by camp counselors, which leads to his death by drowning. There's some confusion around this period. If Jason drowned, how will he turn up as an adult roughly 20 years later? He appears human until he's resurrected halfway through the series, so what gives? Context clues tell us that Pamela turns to the black arts by messing around with the Necronomicon. I believe she is successful in resurrecting him, although she doesn't know it. Jason returns at some point as a living man, perhaps in conjunction with the body possessing that's witnessed in Jason Goes to Hell. Oh, it's all ambiguous, but I read it as, each time Jason dies, he comes back slightly less human. Some fans disagree with this take, which is totally valid. Since this timeline includes Jason Goes to Hell, it's part of the story. July 4th, 1958, during a Camp Crystal Lake sing-along, Pamela kills counselors Barry and Claudette, blaming them for Jason's death. It's unknown if they were the two counselors who were responsible for his drowning the year prior, or if Pamela's rage is blind. Note that it took an entire year before Pamela turned murderous. I believe there is some unknown supernatural phenomena occurring in the shadows. This ties into the ambiguous supernatural elements of Jason's deaths and rebirths. This is what drives Pamela mad. At some point in the late 1950s, Pamela commits multiple arsons that close Camp Crystal Lake. In 1962, Pamela poisons the lake water to keep the camp from reopening. Early 1980, Steve Christie works on reopening his family's camp after nearly 2 decades. He invites his romantic fling, college student Alice Hardy, to work the summer for him. Friday, June 13th, 1980, Steve Christie's counselors converge at the camp to finish setting up the upcoming session. To keep the camp from reopening and still blindly blaming innocent counselors, Pamela murders Steve and 6 of his 7 employees. Pamela is urged by Jason's child voice to commit the murders, even though he is physically in the area, but in hiding. During the moonlit showdown, Alice beheads Pamela, witnessed from the woods by Jason. Suffering mental trauma from the event, Alice rows onto the lake and falls asleep. She dreams that Jason, as a child, emerges from the water to drag her into the lake. The next morning, Alice wakes up in a hospital to learn from the sheriff that her nightmare wasn't real. Unfortunately, she doesn't see it for what it is, a premonition warning her that Jason is coming for her. At this point, Jason is wearing a burlap sack over his head with one eye hole for his good eye. In August of 1980, Alice rents a house in Crystal Lake, hoping to heal from her trauma. But Jason tracks her down and murders her in vengeance for Pamela's beheading. At some point, Camp Crystal Lake is condemned, and a gravestone for Pamela Voorhees is erected on the side of the road, even though she's a mass murderer whose head was never recovered. It's unlikely she's randomly buried there, and more likely she's in the Eternal Peace Cemetery seen in Jason Lives. The cheap roadside grave could be a simple tourist attraction. Her year of death is erroneously listed as 1979 instead of 1980 due to lack of care. I know there are conflicting details, but dialogue in the film states that it's both June and Friday the 13th, and the opening text places it as present day when it was released in 1980, which would match the calendar. In the summer of 1982, teenager Chris Higgins argues with her parents while summering on Crystal Lake. She storms out into the forest and falls asleep. She dreams that Jason attacks her, only to wake up and reconcile with her parents. This event is treated as having really occurred when Chris remembers it 2 years later, but it doesn't make any sense. At this point in the timeline, Jason has hair, and he never tries to rape anyone or just fail like this. Since Chris falls asleep right before he attacks, it makes sense that this is another dream premonition, similar to Alice's. This theory especially makes sense because Chris will have another nightmare of being attacked by a Voorhees at the conclusion of Friday the 13th, Part 3. Thursday, July 12th, 1984. Paul Holt opens a training seminar for camp counselors, including his quasi-girlfriend, psychology student Ginny Fields. The camp draws the attention of local crazy Ralph Neely, who Jason murders. I know that Paul states this occurs 5 years after Pamela's murder spree, but I'm placing it 4 years and 1 month later. It's the only way for the calendars to line up, and it's not a stretch to think that someone vaguely familiar with local history would just round up. The following day, Jason kills a Crystal Lake deputy and 6 of Paul's counselors in training, including Sandra Deer, mostly while the rest of the camp is enjoying their last night in town. Paul and Ginny return and are confronted by Jason. Ginny uses her psychology training to stop Jason. He's believed to be killed until he bursts through a window to attack Ginny, revealing his face for the first time. This is an aged-up version of the malformed child we saw in the first movie. This bit is left unclear, but presumably Paul fights Jason off, and then calls the authorities for help. Early the next morning, paramedics take Ginny to the hospital, while the press covers the story. Sandra's older brother, Rob Deer, is notified of her murder, and he vows to scour the area for closure. Injured from his wounds, Jason escapes the authorities and makes his way to Harold and Edna Hockett's compound, where the two run a small convenience store and farm. He shaves off his stubble, eyebrow, and hair, then steals Harold's clothes and murders the couple. He may believe the change of appearance will help keep the authorities from finding him, since he's lost his sack mask and will don a new mask as soon as he can. The next day, Chris Higgins returns to her family's summer home with 6 friends, where she reacquaints herself with the family's hired hand, Rick. They run afoul of 3 bikers, who Jason murders. He takes for himself a hockey mask from one of his victims, while killing Chris's friends and Rick. She manages to lodge a machete in his head, seemingly killing him, before she rows onto a pond in a traumatic fit. She falls asleep and has another supernatural-induced nightmare, in which Jason terrorizes her, but this time, Pamela emerges from the lake. The next day, Chris awakens to the paramedics taking her away, raving about the woman in the lake coming for her. Jason and his victims are brought to the Wessex County morgue, where he awakens and kills 2 morgue attendants in order to escape back to Crystal Lake. The next day, 6 vacationing teens arrive at Crystal Lake in the cabin beside the Jarvis family. Meanwhile, Tracy Jarvis has brought her teen daughter Trish and 12-year-old son Tommy to their summer home to reconnect following her divorce. She is particularly worried about Tommy, who has been dealing with mental health professionals, due to the backdated medical logs seen in the next movie. Jason kills a hitchhiker on his way back to Crystal Lake. While Rob Deer hunts Jason, Jason murders the 6 vacationing teens, a pair of local twins, and Mrs. Jarvis. While I do appreciate the continuity connecting Rob to Sandra from Part 2, it feels like the producers forgot that, while Part 4 immediately follows Part 3 did the same to Part 2, so it's only been a matter of days for Rob to learn of Sandra's death, investigate Jason, gather weathered newspaper clippings that appear years old, and then head to Crystal Lake. It's not impossible, and there are more egregious timeline snafus in the series, so it's not a total continuity breaker either. Rob alerts Trish and Tommy about Jason before Jason kills him as well. Tommy distracts Jason by reminding Jason of his childhood self, long enough for Trish to knock the hockey mask off his face. He's more grotesque than ever before. Perhaps his face is somewhat malleable due to the hydrocephalus, which explains why he wears the hockey mask. His face here is a gorgeous sculpture that really connects to the vision of the drowned boy from the original film. Trish buries a machete in his face, and then Tommy has a mental snap and loses himself, stabbing Jason's dead body over and over and over and over again. Jason is buried at the Eternal Peace Cemetery, although officials in neighboring areas are told he's cremated, possibly due to Elias Voorhees' influence. That is, according to a deleted scene from Jason Lives. Meanwhile, officials attempt to rename the area Forest Green, although this whole rebranding won't last. On October 13th, 1984, Tina Shepard's telekinetic powers manifest by killing her abusive father on Crystal Lake. She may be affected by the same blood curse urging others to kill, like it did with Pamela, and will with Roy Burns. This placement in the timeline will be hotly contested by fans, but I'll get into my reasons why it's here when we get to Part 7, The New Blood. Rennie Wickham spends the summer of 1987 at Crystal Lake with her uncle, Charles McCulloch. He tries to teach her to swim by pushing her into the lake, and she has a vision of Jason as a child attacking her. This fits with the other characters like Alice and Chris who have visions of Jason before they are really attacked by him. This placement will also be controversial, but it will make sense when I date The New Blood. On Wednesday, October 11th, 1989, Tommy Jarvis, who's been in the care of the state due to his mental break, is transferred to Pinehurst Youth Development Center to transition back to public living. On the trip, he dreams of his younger self witnessing Jason's resurrection. Just as with the previous dream premonitions experienced by Alice and Chris, Tommy's dream of grave robbers accidentally reviving Jason will come true in the next installment. Victor Fadden, a violent patient, murders an orphaned young man named Joey. Paramedic Roy Burns is called to the scene, where he recognizes Joey as the son he gave up. The same paranormal influences that afflicted Pamela attach themselves to Roy and encourages him to dress as Jason to seek blind, rage-fueled vengeance on the world. Note that he wears a Jason face cowl based off the final chapter sculpted head, in the same way the real actors and stunt performers often would wear the cowl while shooting the movies. On top of that, he wears a new hockey mask, noticeably with blue chevrons instead of red. He performs a trial run by killing two greasers having car troubles. The next day, Roy murders the lecherous nurse who brought Tommy to Pinehurst, as well as his waitress girlfriend. Which brings us to another Friday the 13th. Roy murders his paramedic partner, a drifter, the mother-son Pinehurst neighbors, the Pinehurst cook's grandson and his girlfriend, the Pinehurst manager and cook, and 5 Pinehurst residents. He's finally killed by Tommy while trying to kill the cook's other grandson and Pinehurst counselor Pam Roberts. Tommy is brought to the hospital where he has a nightmare of himself donning the hockey mask and attacking Pam. This is another example of the curse urging people to kill. Since the Pinehurst program is ended, Tommy returns to the state-run Unger Institute of Mental Health. On Thursday, July 12th, 1990, Tommy and his roommate escape from the Unger facility to verify that Jason is indeed dead. While this is the most idiotic move he could possibly make, he might be urged on by the paranormal influences. The pair dig up Jason's body during a lightning storm, which resurrects Jason. He's still sporting his wounds from parts 3 and 4, although now only using his bad eye. The lumpiness is gone, perhaps due to his body no longer retaining fluid. Jason kills Tommy's roommate and dons the hockey mask that Tommy made. Tommy flees and Jason heads back to Crystal Lake, where he kills 2 senior counselors on their way to the camp. And on yet another Friday the 13th, Jason treks back to the camp, killing 5 paintballers, a gravedigger, and a young couple. Once back at Crystal Lake, Jason murders 4 camp counselors, 2 deputies, and Sheriff Garris, before Tommy manages to wrap a chain around his neck and sink him to the bottom of Crystal Lake. And this is where I'm diverging from most timelines. Despite some differences in opinion, every timeline I've seen places the opening of New Blood, when Tina psychically kills her father, as the October following Jason Lives, which would be 1990. Then there's a 6 or 7 year time jump. This is when the series really looks ridiculous, as it's continued to be filmed in the 80s, then time jumps near 2000. I have a workaround. New Blood opens with Jason at the bottom of Crystal Lake, then pans over to young Tina. But what if the panning transition is a flashback segue? You view it as we open on present day with Jason at the bottom of the lake. Then we get a pre-credits opening flashback of young Tina, then continue for the rest of the film in present day. This removes the massive time jump after Jason Lives and allows the next movies to take place much closer in time to when they were filmed, which means we can place Part 7, The New Blood, in September of 1991, and not close to Y2K. Tina Shepard returns to Crystal Lake with her mother and psychiatrist, Dr. Cruz, in order to face her past trauma and heal. Meanwhile, a large group of teens plan on throwing a birthday party for their friend Michael in the cottage nearby. Tina accidentally raises Jason while trying to summon her father. Visual continuity is strong here, with Jason retaining the chain around his neck and his mask missing a chunk from the motorboat. Jason immediately murders Michael, his girlfriend, and 2 campers. The following day, Jason kills 9 of the teenagers at the cottage, Mrs. Shepard, and Dr. Cruz, while Tina bonds with Michael's cousin. Tina uses her telekinetic powers to battle Jason and destroys his mask, revealing the gnarliest face of the entire series that contains several callbacks to previous movies. Even the bad eye is now glassy. It is such a good look. Tina eventually raises her father's spirit from the lake to drag Jason back into the water. The next morning, Tina and Michael's cousin are cared for by paramedics. Jason's broken hockey mask is found by a fireman, and sinister whispers are heard, insinuating that the evil presence is tied to the object and attempting to influence someone else, just as it has Pamela, Tommy, and Roy. Note that the Camp Crystal Lake novels occurring after Jason Goes to Hell pick up on this plot line and have Jason's hockey mask possess people and force them to kill. On Tuesday, May 12th, 1992, 2 high school seniors enjoy some sexy time on Crystal Lake. Their boat anchor hits a power line in the water, which electrifies Jason back to life. So he kills the teens and takes the boy's hockey mask for himself. Continuity is hit and miss here. It's not a massive departure, but Jason's clothes are clearly different. They are much less distressed than when he went into the lake. It's supposed to be the same work shirt he stole all the way back in part 3, but it's just not. I don't know why they didn't try to match the look better or let him get new clothes on the boat when he's resurrected. On the flip side, he does remove the chains, from around his neck when he emerges from the lake, which is a great nod to the previous 2 movies. The next day, to celebrate graduation, the senior class of Lakeview High departs Crystal Lake aboard the SS Lazarus, headed to New York City, chaperoned by Miss Van Dusen and Charles McCulloch. Jason boards the ship and murders the captain, engineer, and 4 students before the others realize anything's amiss. During the panic, movie nerd Wayne Weber accidentally shoots a crew member shortly before Jason kills him. While the Lazarus catches on fire, Jason kills 5 more students along with the deckhand. At this point, only the 2 chaperones, Mr. McCulloch's niece Rennie, Captain's son Sean, and an aspiring boxer make it off the ship. During this whole time, Rennie's been having visions of child Jason drowning, tying into the previous dream visions. Countless other students and possible crew members either drown, are killed by Jason, or manage to escape. Jason follows the small group of survivors to New York City, where he kills 2 junkies who assault Rennie, along with the aspiring boxer and a police officer. While trying to flee, Rennie crashes a car, accidentally killing Miss Van Dusen. Jason kills Mr. McCulloch and then a New York City sanitation officer when he stalks Rennie and Sean into the sewers. At the stroke of midnight, Jason is assaulted with toxic sludge, and he loses his mask. And it's a really terrible face reveal. It's like a mushy jack-o'-lantern. Nothing else I can say about it. A drugged-out, hallucinating Rennie sees Jason revert to his childhood self as he is washed away. Jason survives the toxic sludge and treks back to Crystal Lake. At some point, he finds new clothes and a new hockey mask. Possibly due to the toxic sludge or the curse, he starts growing his hair back and regenerating his body. This leads to his face growing around the hockey mask. So there will be no epic unmasking in Jason Goes to Hell because of this face merging. While I will slot in 2 of the 3 series of novels into this timeline, I'm disregarding the 5 Friday the 13th novels that work as a prelude and sequel to Jason Goes to Hell. The books are not great. They disregard film continuity and they don't even fit with each other, unlike the other series I'll add to shortly. The following year, presumably following Jason's public outing in New York City, the FBI has put together a task force to execute him, which they do with great zeal. Jason's blown-apart corpse is flown to a federal morgue in Youngstown, Ohio, where the FBI medical examiner, Phil, is urged to eat the oversized heart, which allows Jason's spirit to possess him. This kills Phil in the process. Leaving the facility, Jason kills a medical assistant and 2 security guards. There's no concrete timeline marker in the film. However, a prop used in the morgue scene, which isn't visible in the final film, only behind the scenes shots, does place the date as August 2nd, which fits perfectly. Over the next week, smarmy TV host Robert Campbell puts together an episode of American Case File on Jason, who is officially responsible for 83 homicides at this point. This lines up fairly well with our own body count, considering, like real serial killers, some murders aren't always attributed to the killer, so a few of them haven't been linked to him. Robert interviews bounty hunter Creighton Duke, who has unexplained paranormal knowledge that Jason can be sent to hell or be reborn by a relative. Robert notes that there have been 5 more Jason-style murders in a line from Youngstown to Crystal Lake. Duke's whole claims that come out of nowhere about Jason changing bodies could explain the differences in his bodies from parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. The original Jason could have died at various points and been reborn in this lore, explaining the ambiguity of a child Jason drowning, an adult Jason appearing in part 2. Your mileage may vary. Jason's half-sister, Diana Kimball, is a waitress in Crystal Lake. She's worried about the news that Jason could be heading their way, so she asks her daughter's ex-boyfriend, Stephen Freeman, to speak to her after her shift. Jason reaches Crystal Lake, where he kills 3 teens camping out, and then a waitress, so he can abduct her boyfriend, Deputy Josh. Jason returns to the old Voorhees house, where he transfers his spirit into Deputy Josh, killing him in the process. While possessing Deputy Josh, Jason kills his niece Diana, but Stephen interferes before Jason can use the body to be reborn. Stephen is arrested for Diana's murder, while Jason escapes. Meanwhile, we learn that Diana's daughter Jessica has recently given birth to Stephen's daughter, Stephanie, and is dating Robert Campbell. In case you're not paying any attention to the little text on the left side of the screen, this timeline allows Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, to end on a Friday the 13th. Stephen learns some lore from Creighton Duke before escaping from jail and heading to the Voorhees house for clues. He spies on Robert Campbell, setting up his TV show because he stole Diana's body and plans on discovering it during the program. But then Jason barges in and transfers his spirit into Robert, killing him and melting Josh's body in the process. Jason goes to the police station to get Jessica, where he kills 3 cops. Jessica escapes with Stephen's help, and they race to the diner where Jessica's friend Vicky is babysitting Stephanie. Jason follows them, killing the cook on his way in. Vicky grabs a shotgun and shoots at Jason, but accidentally kills a customer in the unrated version of the film. Jason then kills the diner owners and Vicky, while Stephen realizes Creighton Duke took baby Stephanie back to the Voorhees house. Unseen, so it's a big reveal later, Jason then possesses Deputy Randy, killing him and then traveling with the sheriff to the Voorhees house. Jessica can't tell who Jason is, so she accidentally stabs the sheriff and then fights off Jason in Randy's body. Diana's corpse is still there, so Jason is able to use it to get himself reborn, looking exactly the way he just did at the start of the movie, only there's a chip out of the mask, and then he kills Creighton Duke. Jason fights Steven until Jessica stabs him with the special dagger, because that's part of the lore now for some reason, which kills Jason. Then Freddy Krueger, of all people, pulls Jason's mask down to hell. We're putting Freddy on the board at over 80 kills, because over on the Elm Street series, they say he killed 20 kids, then another 20 roughly in the movies, around 20 more in the TV series, and another 20 in the books. When I get to doing a proper Elm Street history, I'm sure that number will be much higher. And yes, this bumps Vicky's kill off our list, but that's fair because it only appears in the uncut version of the movie, and I just put up some of the accidental kills as a joke anyway. One of the benefits of this timeline not including the traditional New Blood time jump is this fits perfectly with the 4 Camp Crystal Lake novels: Mother's Day, Jason's Curse, The Carnival, and Road Trip. The books erroneously place Crystal Lake in Massachusetts because Jason Goes to Hell references Connecticut, but otherwise are a really fun throwback to nostalgic slashers. Basically, Jason's cursed hockey mask acts as a conduit for the evil to possess whomever wears it into murdering teens. It fits in right with the more supernatural elements of the series that are only hinted at in the films. The next entry in the series to be released was Jason X. And I'm bucking timeline traditions even more by placing it next because I believe the movie doesn't occur in real time, but is representative of Jason's years in hell. This is the only way to believably keep it in canon. When we see Jason in hell in Freddy vs. Jason, he's being forced to relive killing teens. This is the same thing happening in Jason X. Jason doesn't relish killing. It's hellish, unending work for him. Also keep in mind that Jason died as a kid in the 1950s when pulpy sci-fi was very popular. It makes sense that his afterlife would latch onto those tropes and throw him into cliched scenarios. In this one, he's got sort of a Frankenstein's monster vibe going. Without the mask, it looks like his face is still regenerating, although his forehead still shows where the mask dug into his skin. And at this point, he's chained up, reminiscent of the chains around his neck in earlier movies, and wearing a weathered hockey mask. And of course, midway through the movie, he's destroyed but rebuilt with nanobots into Uber Jason. There's no need for an unmasking because the shiny new mask is part of his face again. If you are a fan of Jason X and want more tropey sci-fi campy fun, then the 4 Jason X novels, The Experiment, Planet of the Beast, Death Moon, and To the Third Power, fit in right after this and can easily be slotted in as more misadventures during Jason's time in hell. During this time, in 1999, in Springwood, Ohio, teenager Will Rollins witnesses Freddy Krueger killing the mother of his girlfriend, Lori Campbell. And while we're at it, this is around the time that Freddy kills Bobby Davis. On Friday, October 13th, 2003, Freddy Krueger finds Jason in hell, where Jason is trapped reliving the same cliched camp killings as usual, and Freddy uses him as a means to resurrect himself. There's no proper unmasking, but set photos do show off Jason's full face. His skin returns to the dark, crispy, decayed texture from when he was first zombified, and his hair's growing back. He again sports a hockey mask. I'm dating this here based on the events occurring several days before October 18th, which is shown on screen later, and aligning it with the Friday the 13th. Several days later, Freddy guides Jason to a remodeled 1428 Elm Street in Springwood, Ohio, which is tied to Freddy's backstory. Lori Campbell is having a sleepover with 2 friends, and 2 guys show up. Jason murders one of the boys to instill terror in the other teens, and then follows Freddy's orders to kill the other boy and his dad while the girls are interrogated by the police. Laurie's ex-boyfriend, Will Rollins, is an inmate at Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital with Bobby's younger brother, Mark. They see the news report on the murders and escape from the hospital. The next day, Freddy's terror grows as Will and Laurie reconnect, but Freddy's not powerful enough to return yet, so he sends Jason to a rave in a cornfield to kill several Springwood teens in his name. Mark returns to his home, and Freddy kills him. The others spend the night hiding out together, planning their next move. They sneak into Weston Hills for the Hypnocil, which would allow them not to dream, and this is when the security monitor gives us the October 20th date. Jason kills a security guard, a helpful cop, and the stoner when Freddy possesses him to attack Jason. The gang drives Jason back to Crystal Lake for a final showdown with Freddy after he's pulled into the real world, and Jason kills half of the remaining teen group. The outcome of the titular battle is a little ambiguous. It's not just Freddy versus Jason, but Freddy versus Jason and Laurie and Will, because the teens help Jason against him. Ultimately, as presented on screen, Freddy and Jason fight to a draw, and then Laurie shoves Freddy's knife glove through his body, killing him. So I'm giving Freddy's kill here to Laurie. Some fans will not be pleased by this, and I'm honestly not that pleased by it either, but we gotta respect what's on the screen. There are several Friday the 13th related comics, but Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash takes the only one I'm including because it fits continuity so well and feels like a natural extension of the series since it started as a proposed next installment in the franchise before it was canceled and adapted into a comic series. For the most part, Jason's look matches his Freddy vs. Jason appearance, only his skin is even darker and his mask sports Freddy's claw marks from their fight. The marks all go in the same direction because Freddy only swipes left. Interestingly, Freddy vs. Jason's original ending had Freddy killing Laurie and Will. But this story opens 5 years later with Jason having that privilege when they investigate Crystal Lake. Freddy's still dead, but he's also trapped in Jason's psyche. Ash Williams from the Evil Dead franchise is sent to the Crystal Lake Super Ultra Mega S-Mart and arrives when Jason does. This fits in nicely with the construction site from the movie because there's a big push to build up the area economically. Jason kills 3 teen customers leaving the store, and then 5 Christmas carolers on his way to the Voorhees house to retrieve the Necronomicon under Freddy's orders. Freddy plans on using the book to not just restore himself, but be bigger and better than ever. Ash follows 4 teens to the house to find the Necronomicon while they party, and Jason kills 3 of them. Ash gets the Necronomicon and saves one named Bree, then heads back to S-Mart to figure out a plan with co-worker Caroline. Jason arrives and kills at least 15 S-Mart shoppers and the store manager, then battles Ash, kills Bree to retrieve the Necronomicon, and leaves with it, in a scene that would have rivaled the Cornfield Rave massacre. While Ash, Caroline, and 3 other S-Mart employees head to her home to regroup, Jason gives Freddy the Necronomicon. Freddy casts a waking nightmare spell to allow himself back into the real world as master of the Necronomicon. Freddy attacks Ash in his sleep and kills one of the other S-Mart employees. Ash's group assaults the Voorhees house, and Jason kills the other 2 S-Mart employees, then turns on Freddy. Freddy uses the Necronomicon to resurrect Jason's victims from the movies in a fun continuity bit of fan service, and turns the Voorhees house into the Elm Street house. We get a great face reveal here when Ash shotguns Jason's head, which blows away the hockey mask and the lower half of Jason's face. Freddy, Jason, and Ash all duke it out until Ash and Caroline are able to use the Necronomicon to open a portal and banish Freddy into it, and freeze Jason in the bottom of the lake. And that's where Jason is left, at the bottom of Crystal Lake, because I just can't count the sequel comic, Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, The Nightmare Warriors, as canon because the continuity is so bad, and the story itself is just not great. I'm being nice. But that leaves us with one last entry on the timeline thanks to my personal headcanon. I like to think that after Jason Takes Manhattan, aspiring horror writer Rennie wrote about Jason, and her books were used as the basis for the 2009 movie, since it consists of elements from the first 4 movies, sort of like a mashup of if this was a true crime story. It's my mental gymnastics to keep the movie in canon, and for completion's sake, here's Jason's looks in the film, which would have been modeled after the few eyewitnesses from the 1980s. He starts the movie off in a sack mask, which only has the one eye hole for his good eye. And this one is much more tailored than the one we saw in part 2. But of course, he ditches that for a hockey mask midway through the movie, and this look reveals more of his face and ginger hair. It was planned for a big face reveal, in the climax, but this was scrapped. Behind the scenes footage do show us how Jason would have looked. It's a more muscular version of his part 2 look. Not too shabby. Well, actually very shabby, but in a good way. Well, thank you for watching my first video. I have a ton of ideas for more videos covering different franchises and characters. If you'd like to support me and make the process easier and quicker, I set up a Patreon. I'm putting up high-res versions of all the digital art and additional facts, trivia, and commentary over there. It's at Horror Histories Illustrated, link down below. This is Doc Silverscreams, signing off.